Okay.
Okay, should we just give it a minute and then I'll start?
Yeah, I think that, yes, please.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, I think we will start. I just want to say welcome to everyone that has logged on to our first webinar, and that is how COVID-19 has affected civil liberties around the world. So today we're going to just be having a chat really, and the structure will be going through what the rules are in our jurisdiction and then looking at how those rules accord with everyone's civil liberties. So Gitesh won't be joining us today for personal reasons, but on the panel we have Angelique, Gobind and Rafid. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we can answer them as we go along. And we will also have a short Q&A at the end if you have any questions that come to you. So to start, my name is Iona Gallagher. I was called to the bar in July 2019 at Inner Temple, and I currently work as an advocacy support worker for victims of the Northern Ireland Troubles. I am applying for pupillage, so that's fun. So this is something really interesting to fill my time, and I get to work with really wonderful, hardworking people that I met on my bar course. So when we first decided why we wanted to do this webinar, COVID-19 is happening right now, it's relevant, and we thought about how different the rules and regulations were in each of our jurisdictions. So that's what we will be talking about today. So I will begin by giving you a brief overview of what things are like here, and then I will turn to each of the panelists and they will go through what things are like with them and I can ask them some questions. So here I'm in London, in England and Wales, we have the Coronavirus Act 2020, and that came into force on the 26th of March last year. So within that, I'm firstly going to focus on police powers. So under Schedule 21 of the Coronavirus Act, police were given powers to control the movements of potentially infectious people. They could ask someone to go for a screening and to also control their movement. And when we consider whether or not this is proportionate, well, in theory, yes, it sounds as though it is. If someone is showing symptoms or is ill and we are dealing with a pandemic, we want to do what we can to try and control it. However, we now know that 1 in 3 people are actually asymptomatic and show no symptoms. So when we look at the powers that the police have and how they can actually use those powers in a fair and proportionate way, it's very difficult. And in England and Wales last year, between May and March, we had 44 wrongly issued charges. And of those, there were 13 wrongful convictions. And the reason for that was that none of the reasons for the persons being controlled or detained under the Coronavirus Act were based in law. They were not potentially infectious. And it shows an issue with trying to use a kind of one rule fits all. And recently, I've seen a lot of different things on Twitter where people are having the same problem, because each police force is issuing these regulations in a different way. Some people interpret it one way and others in a different way. And that has resulted in a huge varying number of fines for different reasons. And people are appealing these fines, and some are successful and some are not. But what we can see is a really inconsistent, unfettered exercise of power by the police. And this has really been highlighted during the pandemic. The second thing I wanted to highlight is, stepping away for a moment from the Coronavirus Act, is ministerial decisions. And there was a decision made in April 2020 by Matt Hancock, who is the Secretary of State for Health, to share private, confidential NHS patient data. This order was issued for 6 months, and it was later extended. And it specified that the process of confidential patient data was to be shared to support the Secretary of State's response to COVID-19. When we consider whether or not this decision is proportionate, it's very difficult to assess whether or not it actually is, because patients were never asked for their consent. So we have no informed consent from the patients whose data is being shared. But even if they were asked, even if they were approached and they said, look, do we have your permission to share this data? We don't know. It's unclear who the data is being shared with and what the real purpose is. What is this sharing of information actually going to do to help battle the pandemic? Another issue within that is that even if their data that's being shared is anonymized, we know that anonymized data is never really anonymous. And there has been a considerable breach of patients' private life, their confidentiality, and it was a decision that was taken out of their hands, and it is still in force. So that's a very brief overview from me. And they are two issues that I personally think have been really surprising and shocking during the pandemic. So I will now turn to Rafid and ask him about Bangladesh. And Rafid was called to the bar by Lincoln's Inn in 2019. He is currently practicing as a corporate lawyer at Sean Noble and Associates. And as though he wasn't busy enough, he's also a part-time lecturer of law at London College of Legal Studies South, and he has kindly fitted us in, and after many hours of classes is doing this webinar. So I will hand over to Rafid, and I will ask you a couple of questions as we go along. Rafid.
Thank you very much, Iona. You were far too kind, but thank you nonetheless. And first of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to kind of share my side of the story sitting here in Bangladesh of how we or the government of Bangladesh has been tackling the matter so far, and kind of provide an opinion on whether they have been successful, whether the measures that they've taken it's not very conventional, but has it worked? Those are the questions that I'll be addressing. My first half of my discussion will mostly focus on the specific laws and regulations which excuse me, came into place as soon as the coronavirus pandemic started. And the second half of the discussion would be more on how the government tried to use other measures in order to ensure that the economy survives this pandemic. Now, first of all, Iona, thank you very much for some of the insights about UK, because it would be easier for me to make a comparison. Being a developing country in comparison to a developed country such as the United Kingdom, some of the things that you mentioned are probably not as important in Bangladesh as it is in the UK. For example, when speaking from experience, when I'm advising foreign clients, when we have instructions from foreign companies who are trying to set up business in Bangladesh, and they ask us questions as to how much information that they can take in from an employee, whether they have to take the consent, for how long they can store and everything. We don't have laws regarding this. So when you were mentioning about the hospital patients, you see, in Bangladesh, that would not be a problem, like them getting your information without probably asking you, or probably at least not informing you what it is being collected for, how long they're going to store it, are they going to share it with an international body. You see, none of those matter here. I mean, of course, we are working, we're trying to improve our digital security. We have the new Digital Security Act 2018, which has tried covering some of those situations, but we are still not there where excuse me, where we can say that as of right, you need to take my consent before you collect information as such.
Can I ask,
Now,
do you think
yes,
that
please.
because people don't mind, they say, oh, I don't mind, yes, do what you want with my data, or that perhaps they don't fully understand what the implications of that could be?
I don't know. I think it would be a combination of both. First would probably be the fact that it's something. The fact that there's a digital world. The fact about digital currency. The fact that digitally you have a profile, which can be used to target you, or like you have a consent. You have a say in that as well. Not a lot of people are concerned about that. Maybe 10% of the population, but rest of the 90% are probably not as bothered. And then comes the implications. Like most people would be like, yeah, what are they going to do with those information? Well, I'm not important enough. Or you know what I mean. It's something that's probably going to be more. Let's say in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, people will probably be a bit more careful then, because let's say my senior, he's very careful about this, and that's on a personal level. So he's very careful about if he's providing his bank details somewhere. Whenever they're sending in a form, when he's giving his information, he's very careful about what information he's providing. But you see, that's probably one in out of the 10 associates that's working in the farm. So that kind of represents Bangladesh at the moment. So as I was saying, luckily, we got lucky in the sense that in 2018, Bangladesh enacted a law. It's known as the Contagious Diseases Act 2018. The law was originally enacted to take into account Ebola, anthrax, HIV, MERS. So all of these were the things that were taken into. Actually, there was a list of 23 diseases that was taken into account on that. As soon as the COVID-19 hit and it came to Bangladesh, the first cases were reported in March 8th, 2020. What the government and the court in conjunction did was, instead of enacting a new law, they incorporated COVID into the law. So the High Court of Bangladesh, there was a writ petition. Writ petition is a similar form of the same thing in UK is called a judicial review. So there was writ petition that, what is the government doing about this? And in March 18, the High Court asked the government, not asked, they ordered the government to include COVID-19 into the list of the 23 diseases. And in March 23rd, the Health Ministry published a gazette which said that COVID is also a contagious disease and it will fall under the ambit of the Contagious Diseases Act 2018. Which meant,
Rafi,
yes, please, I don't know.
By incorporating it into an existing piece of legislation that I assume had been debated and kind of put through in the proper way, is a better alternative than kind of what we had here. We had the Coronavirus Act rushed through Parliament. It was debated, but they didn't have the opportunity to make any amendments. Do you think it's a fairer way that it's been done in Bangladesh?
On the hindsight, yes, because when they did enact the law back in 2018, there was substantial debate. They had time to change, reform the law, and take it to a position where it made sense and it wasn't too unfair on the people or their civil liberties. And adding COVID-19 to it kind of just forwarded that for the next couple of years, instead of having a completely new act which had new regulations, new restrictions in place. So I feel, yeah, this was, but you see, it's also all about timing. I mean, imagine if the 2018 Act wasn't enacted, let's say it was due to be enacted in, let's say, 2021, and we would be in the same position that the UK was in. And we just got lucky, like I said. And so, yeah, I would say that our government had more checks and balances in place with all the restrictions that they came into. And in general, uh, speaking from personal point of view, I felt the government was a bit more prepared than we've seen with a lot of other countries as well. It's because, being we have faced a couple of not diseases, but we have faced several events which has rocked the countries over the past few years, be it a hurricane, be it a tsunami and stuff like that. So this act kind of, it was more like kind of consolidating what the government and the executive bodies have already been doing. So it was a practiced method of doing things. So when I remember when our lockdown started, so on March 23rd, the government published a gazette and the act came into force. And the power of that act, they said that, the whole country will be on a lockdown. You need to shut down all the offices, schools, and everything. And it was it was properly implemented for the next 2 months, I would say. People were very careful about this. Everyone ensured that, they listened to it. Everyone was being careful. And that, by being everyone, I mean people from all walks of life, from people who are maybe on white collar jobs to people who are in blue collar jobs. Everyone kind of followed this through without any complaints or questions. So no one was asking, why am I, having to stay home? I want to go out and maybe take a walk. And no one asked that. Part of it was because people did not know how serious COVID-19 could be. I think that was the fear. And the second thing, like I said, because of an act which was enacted 2 years back, executives got the police, in some places the army were deployed as well, places which were more sensitive than the others, and everyone kind of listened to them, and which was good. It worked. So initial question, and this kind of ties into the discussion that we're having today. This law, I'll just be very brief with what the law stated. It allows the government and local authorities to ensure that, they can say that a place is in lockdown. So it doesn't have to be the whole city. They can say that a particular area can be put into lockdown, and that's a power given by this act. They can fine people or even send people to jail if they're kind of intentionally spreading the diseases. And by diseases, they of course mean contagious diseases. And of course, COVID-19 is now a contagious disease as per the law. And so it gave the executives power, and people kind of ensured that, they abide by it as well. There was no question. But then the issue that happened, and I think that's a problem of being probably a third world nation, is that our economy started suffering. So people started burning through their savings, and people started losing their jobs and everything. And that's when government probably realized that while this isn't, while this is working, it's an excellent measure, our numbers are in control, but the economy will not last. That's when the government, even though they were heavily criticized for these decisions, I remember we had so two of our important festivals. And one of them was Eid al-Fitr, which took place around May last year. And right after that, they opened up all the garments. And in Bangladesh, the RMG sector is very important because it brings us substantial remittance into Bangladesh. And so they decided to open that up. And that would mean putting in thousands of people in a cramped space, working together. And we thought around that time, and as soon as they did that, they allowed all the offices to open up. I have been going to work since July, and we were allowed to do so from June. The only thing that the government decided not to do was to not open up any educational institutions. So till date, all the schools, universities still remain closed. Now, going back to the decision, what happened was our numbers never really skyrocketed. It was, I'm not trying to downplay it, but it was never a point where it was worrying. There were times, there were days when the numbers were quite high, but it was never in a situation where, like, we need to shut down the country again. It never came to a second lockdown ever, even when the second wave hit.
Here, because we had a first wave, the second wave, and then we've just been going. It's our third lockdown now.
I completely agree. I mean, and that's a comparison that I wanted to bring. And you see, there are decisions by the government, and you don't know which one is right and which one's wrong, because you see, in the UK they opened up the schools, and there was a huge number of COVID, affected pupils in schools, if I'm not mistaken, in the initial phase. And our government still remains adamant. And it's funny, the students have actually protested because they want the schools to open up, but the government has been very adamant because they believe that students or young generation is less equipped or less educated about this matter, and they might be the reason for another outbreak. So they've kind of tried controlling that so far. And like I said, that has worked. And so far numbers have been going down. Vaccine wise, we are actually, I was just checking the list the other day. I think we're the eighth most vaccinated country, as in terms of numbers. We had I think it's 0.35 or 3.5 million people have already been vaccinated. The first dose has been given to them as well. So we're in a situation where the government has kind of, so let me just walk you down the timeline. That will probably clarify the whole situation. So initially there was the act, which kind of in 2 weeks time, the government decided to make COVID a part of the Contagious Diseases Act, which governed how the executives, the local authorities, the city corporation, and the government in general could control people's movement, and how they spread or how they not spread diseases. They stopped, it's common all over the world. They stopped, people meeting up. They stopped public places, but they did it through an act which was already in place since 2018. Number two, for the first 2 months, while they were sitting down at home, and people, like I said, except for probably a couple of very limited number of people, everyone was okay and on board with the laws and lockdown in place. But then when government realized that the economy is suffering, they started publishing more gazettes. So I think I was mentioning this to you earlier the other day, that most of our rules and regulation, instead of, even though yes, we do have an act which kind of tells you what to do with the disease itself, but everything pertinent to it was all achieved through smaller gazettes, SROs, and government executive orders that each ministry published over time. So we would have, like, let's say, and I tried doing a compilation for the first couple of months, and there were just so many I couldn't, keep updated about all of them. But they ensured that your loan classification does not go down. For the SMEs, they had stimulus packages that you're going to get loan interest free, so that your business kind of it stays still. You are at least in place. Some of the startups that we represent in our law firm has actually done better during the lockdown because of the stimulus packages, because they had the support from the government. Third, so all of this decision was more kind of focused towards ensuring that the economy runs, people have a job, and they have money in their bank account, which I think worked in support of the government, because then people were not questioning whether why is my civil liberty being affected? Why cannot I throw a party at my house? Why cannot I go to my friend's place? Because somewhere or the other, they were like, okay, my business is surviving. I'm getting the support from the government. And even one interesting decision that our prime minister took was, and this was something that even I think I was skeptical about, she invested about 100 crore or 1000 crore taka into the research on the Oxford vaccine that India produced, and which finally we got 0.5 million doses of, 50 lakh, which is about 5 million doses of. So you see, initially we were very skeptical, like, you're just wasting money when you could have put this money inside the economy and everything. But now, because of that, we were one of the first countries to receive vaccine from India.
Do you think
People are,
there's a willingness as well? So it sounds as though, there wasn't a lot of people kind of embraced the rules and were, happy to kind of follow them because they saw the benefits, because it was very much a balancing of rights for them. And as you said, the economy was improving, so they didn't mind having to stay home. Do you think there'll be any difficulties, or do you envision, compelling employees to take the vaccine? Because at the minute we have a case happening where the question is whether or not an employer could compel employees to take the vaccine, or could they only recruit people who have taken the vaccine. If, you know, for example, if they're working with vulnerable people or if they're in that kind of role, do you think there would be any backlash if people were compelled to take it, ordered, or do you think they'd be quite willing?
That's a tricky question, Iona, because this has a lot to do with the mentality of the people. I understand where you're coming from, and I can't say that, you know, that might never happen. That might actually come up at some point or the other, where, you know, your employers are kind of forcing you to take your vaccine if you want to go back to work. But I feel that's something that is, I feel, because so far people have been getting vaccines by themselves. You know, even now it's discretionary, and people have been doing it quite happily. So, judging by this recent last couple of weeks statistics, I would say there should not be significant backlash against this. It's more like, you know, that's something I wanted to do, but now I have to do. So, you know, it's not a problem for me. Because initially, I think when the vaccine was coming in, I think it was in January, end of January, and there was a lot of people were skeptic, like they did not want to take the vaccine. They were worried about the side effects. But it drastically changed in, let's say, as soon as people started getting vaccinated, it's changed drastically. See, so the vaccine rule for in Bangladesh is that if you're 55 years plus, you could take the vaccine, and it could be for anyone. I mean, of course, if you are a frontliner, if you're a doctor, you of course got priority. But otherwise, anyone over 55 plus could take it. And because people were not too much interested to get it, they lowered the age limit to 40 plus. And more people started getting it. And as far as I know, I think already 80% of the dose have been, it has been depleted already. So I think out of the 5 million, I think 3.2 or 3.5 million has already been, you know, it has already been given. The shots have been given to people, the first dose at least. So I think over the time, people started embracing it and they were less skeptical. And if the trend moves forward, and we have a private organization, Beximco, which is a huge pharmaceuticals company in Bangladesh, they're bringing it so the first dose that came in Bangladesh and is being administered at the moment, it's free. It's done by the government. But Beximco is bringing in private, so they're privatizing the whole thing. I mean, it's separate from the government. The government will also be bringing it, but Beximco is also, they also have placed an order with the Indian Serum Institute, and they're going to bring it. And it's not very expensive. It's 1,000 taka, which is about 10 pounds, and people can get it whenever they want. And you see, the reason I'm pointing this out is because at the end of the day, the pharmaceutical company is there to make a profit, and they wouldn't take this risk if they didn't think that people would be, you know, willing to take the shot, willing to take that vaccine. So based on that, I would say that I'm not expecting a significant backlash. But of course, there will always be a couple of people, you know, who would be like, yeah, well, that's not something that, and we will probably have a writ petition or a judicial review against the government for the decision. I'm sure there will be one. But yeah, I mean, just to end on a light note, so initially back in end of January, so we had, the government was actually sued, not sued. There was a judicial review filed against them for, you know, it was from a parent. He was a lawyer. He was the claimant, and he was a lawyer as well. And he said that I, you know, my child's studies are being hampered. You need to open up the institutions. And the government was just planning to open up in February, and then they got a legal notice and a writ petition on like how they should not do this because it's just gonna be, you know, affecting everyone's health and everything. And so you see, there are always two sides of the story, and I think in a country like Bangladesh, it's more about balancing, you know, one against the other. And so far, I think it's been almost a year, and our government has been doing all right so far. So yeah, that's kind of it from my side.
That was so interesting, Rafid. It's so interesting as well to see how different, you know, how different things are in different jurisdictions. And yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure as well.
I'm now going to move on to Angelique. Angelique is in the lovely Seychelles, so I'm sure the weather is beautiful there. She is an accredited mediator with the ADR ODR International, and she's currently setting up her own mediation practice and legal consultancy. So I will now pass over to Angelique.
Thank you, Iona, and hi, everyone. Hi, Rafid and Gobin and everyone who's joined us. I think Rafid and Iona have highlighted quite a lot of different things that we will see is quite different in Seychelles, because I think first thing is introducing Seychelles, because a lot of people don't actually know where Seychelles is. Yeah, so we're found in the middle of the Indian Ocean, not far from Mauritius, which hopefully a lot of people know where Mauritius is. And unfortunately, Gitesh is not here, so he's sort of our neighbor. Our population currently stands at 98,745 people. So it hasn't even reached 100,000. So with COVID-19 and its outbreak, it has greatly impacted a lot of people in our country. And so following on to your structure, I think what I would want to do is discuss how the legislation is made and who takes the decision in our country, and then move on to taking two of the regulations and how they impact civil liberties. So like Rafid mentioned, we do have the Public Health Act 1960, so it's quite old, but it has been amended to take into consideration the new developments in the coronavirus outbreak in Seychelles. And so with that, there's the infectious disease section in the Public Health Act 1960, which deals specifically with infectious diseases. And in this case, it's COVID-19. And what's quite startling is that it's the first time, I mean, we could say it's the first time that we've actually had to deal with such an outbreak. We've had about 2,596 cases in total, which is quite a lot when you look at our population. And we have also recorded 11 deaths already. So it has greatly impacted our country. Like you said, the sunny Seychelles is now filled with people wearing masks everywhere we go, hand sanitizing, washing your hands, temperature checks. It's very different from, the tourism back then where you could walk freely and everything. So it's taken an impact. And so with regards to the regulations now, the Public Health Commissioner, who's an official of the Ministry of Health, is the person who makes these orders. But he is consulted by a Platinum Committee, who is chaired by the President and his ministers and members of the National Assembly. So they consult each other before the public orders are introduced to the public. And so I think, bearing in mind that Seychelles is a tiny community, we all know everyone. Two of the main things that have been impacted is freedom of movement. And like you said, the police in England have been, dealing with infected people. In our country, we've restricted movement between 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. in the morning. So we can't move. It's sort of like a curfew. And so with that, we're a country, I will not lie, we enjoy our weekends. We like going to the beach. It's a fun country to be with. So thinking about that, without being able to move at 8 in the evening and being stuck home, it wasn't a welcome idea. And so the police
what would you be fined if you were found outside, or what would
Yeah, so they have a fine set at 20,000 Seychelles rupees if you're caught during the curfew period. They also have three things that the police can do. They can tell you to go back to your house. They can accompany you back to your house and detain you there, and then they can fine you, or if you resist, then they can arrest you and put you into prison. So I think there are these options, but the good thing about that is with the fine, I think a lot more people are willing to listen to it, because our economy has really been impacted by COVID, especially given the fact that we do base our economy on tourism. And we have had to reduce the amount of people that come into our country. Tourists really don't have the money to come for a holiday, given that they have to spend 10 days in quarantine in their establishment and then after be able to move about. And so it's very difficult for someone to take a 2-week holiday, let's say from England, to come all the way to Seychelles and be stuck in a room for 10 days and then get 4 days to move around. It's not really
When did that quarantine period start? Because I know here we have just started, I think within the last couple of weeks, that people arriving from this red list of countries will have to quarantine in a hotel for 10 days and then they can leave. But that was very recent. I wondered how long was that implemented?
So, I think with COVID happened very recently, the major outbreak, we could say our first wave in December, late December. And so that's when the numbers kind of spiked up. But with that being said, it wasn't only that COVID had happened here, it was the development of COVID around the world and the fact that we were receiving people from these countries that may be potentially at risk of having COVID. So when they come to our country, then they have to have the negative PCR test and all that to be able to enter our country. And then in our government right now, we have a list of approved countries where people can actually come from. So we don't accept all tourists actually. And the quarantine was quite important because at the beginning of the outbreak, it was mainly the tourists who were positive rather than locals. And this kind of flipped around completely with now our locals having community transmission and the tourists just having a minimal number of, cases. Yeah, and then we have seafarers as well who also contribute to our amount of COVID-19 numbers, given that they are those people who work on the tuna boats. So they come from Spain, for example. We have a lot of Spanish sailors who come from Spain. They come to Seychelles. They board the boats that go get tuna. So the little John West tunas that you're buying at Tesco is from Seychelles. Yes, so those men go out and they fish the tuna. And unfortunately, what has happened is when they came into the country, they left on the boat, and then when they come back is when we realize that they are positive with COVID. So that's yet another issue that has arisen. So with going back to the regulation, with the restriction of movement, I think has helped in some way in reducing the amount of COVID-19 that we could have, but it hasn't completely alleviated the risk, because we've had in a day 156 cases, positive cases, which is quite significant. And you're thinking, okay, well, people are going home at 8, they're home at 8, they're leaving at home probably at 7 in the morning, then it should be fine. But during the day, we're still allowed to move around, go to shops, go to government offices, continue our lives basically, while socially distancing, wearing masks. But the risk is always there, and it's always—
in terms of the rules, just to so here we don't have curfew, but we have, we're in our third lockdown, and the restaurants aren't open to sit in and have dinner. We can't go in and have a coffee somewhere. We can have takeaways, and not all the shops are open again. Kind of clothing and everything isn't open. Is everything open with you?
Yeah, so in January, they closed down all the retail shops and restaurants. And in this month, like the beginning of February, they started easing up on the opening hours of retail shops. So for now, like this week, a lot of retail shops have been open. They have strict regulations to follow before they can get open. So the Public Health Commissioner has to approve your opening hours and to see that you have a sanitization station and all that. So it's starting to open up, but I don't really know how well that will work. With restaurants, they have been taking takeaway orders, but not sit-ins. But like I said, if we're still moving around, we're still bumping into each other, the risks will always be there. And so if I were to contrast that now with the fact that we have a very aggressive COVID vaccine campaign currently going on in Seychelles, and I do know that you and Rafi mentioned that you have people only taking the first dose. We have some people in Seychelles who've already taken both their doses, so they're fully protected. And that happened when the ministers and the executive actually were the first few people to take the vaccine early on when we got donated. So now they're fully protected, which is really good, because then at least we know that if tomorrow there is a major outbreak, then they're protected and they can continue to manage the country. And so even with, like you said, Rafid, I think the limit is now 40-year-olds. In Seychelles, yesterday, they were giving vaccines to above 18-year-olds. So it's quite good. It's reached to that level that a lot of people are now allowed to go and take their vaccine. And it is voluntary, it's free. I don't think there will be a privatization of the vaccine, which is really good in our country because we're small. And I don't think that it would be best to privatize it. It wouldn't be fair on us. But the fact that we're offering it to everyone, and hopefully in 2 months' time, everyone can be vaccinated, that's a really good good point, and it's a good thing that the executive have been putting so much emphasis on this. And so with the vaccine campaign, I think that in Seychelles, we could be looking at an easing up on the restriction of movement. And another thing is, with the regulations, it has affected the right to assembly. So you did mention the beaches. You would think that the beaches would be like spotted with tens of people, like, you know, having fun on their weekend, but it isn't like that anymore. So you have police doing spot checks of how many people are on the beaches. Are they wearing masks? Are they a household group, or are they different friends? It's quite alarming when you see that now, because we're so used to just going to the beach, just hanging out with people, and now you can't. It's limited to at least 4 people, and it's quite sad, but it is necessary. And I think that people have realized that it is really important that we take this and do our best now, because we don't want this to continue, because schools are still shut down, and it's affecting the kids as well, because everything is online. I think we didn't expect this to happen in Seychelles, and it happened so quickly that it changed all our lives. And so you have parents who can't work.
About you just mentioned about the vaccine kind of rollout. I just wondered, because I think here there is varying views. Some people are very, willing to take the vaccine, and some people are very anti-vaccine. Do you think there's like a big divide like that where you are, or do you think that it's more likely that people are more willing to take the vaccine and kind of get on with things?
Yeah, it's quite divided, because like I mentioned, they had given the first dose to a lot of people, and then they did call them back for the second dose, and the turnout was pretty low, and I'm not sure why. I think maybe the reason varies between people, but I wouldn't say there aren't any anti-vaxxers in Seychelles, because we truly don't know what's in the vaccine, and we could never really say. And so what has happened is, in response to that, yesterday, actually, the Minister for Health released a statement and an order saying that the vaccine that has been given has been approved by an approved medical organization. And so that they're okay to be given and taken. So that if the minister has approved it and they have gone through the procedures of getting it approved internationally, then we shouldn't have a reason to not take it. And I think what we have to realize is we're in a country where we're being offered vaccines for free, and it's being given to so many people, in contrast to all of the other countries where I have no idea how long it'll take for you all to be vaccinated. And so with the anti-vaxxers, surely it's voluntary for you to take the vaccine. But at the end of the day, I think if we do want to help our economy, we do have to sort of give a little to get what we want. And so being vaccinated, all of us, I think, would help us open up our markets as well for tourism, because that's our main market. And being vaccinated and protected, then we could receive more tourists. But I think it's up to people at the end of the day. I think we could do all we want and say the vaccine is the best thing that could exist, or it could be the worst thing. You could be growing a third head for all I know. But it's up to you, and it's your duty whether or not you want to take the vaccine. And so I do applaud Seychelles for having this aggressive vaccination campaign. And the availability of the vaccine as well is another great thing, because it hasn't been easy to get these vaccines. We've had Sinopharm from India, from Dubai actually donated Sinopharm. We have COVID Shield, and we're getting the Sputnik, I think, from Russia. So the government is trying their best to help us get vaccinated. And I think one thing that I heard Rafid mention was the right to business. I think we had a discussion previously. And so with the right to business, the government has quite willingly supported local businesses, tourism establishments, restaurants, and all that for quite a while. And so now what has happened is, because COVID has taken such a long time, that we are running out of financial resources. And so we have to pull back on the assistance. And so this goes back to the people's willingness to actually get vaccinated, and let's open up our business. Because I think my business is mine and I should be willing to work towards it and open it up and get the revenue that I need. And so I think the regulations that have been in place, I will never say they won't affect civil liberties. So your freedom of movement, your freedom of right to assembly and association, it's been affected, yes. But at the cost of not getting affected by COVID, I think, and not risking your lives as well, because 11 people are currently dead with COVID, unfortunately. And I think this all goes to protecting ourselves from coronavirus, because tomorrow we don't know what could happen. And so the fact that we have this protection is really important. And I think it's really good that you chose to have this webinar on this, because Seychelles is small. And I think when originally COVID got out, a lot of people were like, Seychelles will never get this. It's a small island. We don't have to worry about it. It's hot. There was this whole theory of, hot tropical countries not being able to have corona, which unfortunately is not true, by the way. But it happened. And I think the way we've reacted as well, it might have been quite shocking to a lot of people, but it was necessary. And so with the way the regulations have been drafted as well, although not as intense as in Bangladesh or England, it really has sort of clamped down a bit on the spread of corona in our country. And so I do applaud the government, I do applaud the country as well, and its people for actually going out and taking their vaccines and wearing their masks as well, because people took it very difficultly to wear a mask, because we live in a country where it's fresh air, breezes, you go to the beach, and now you have to wear a mask. It's not really ideal. It doesn't go with our outfits as well. So it's quite difficult. It was quite difficult for people to accept that originally. But now it's good to see that people are taking on board the regulations and wearing their masks and doing the necessary. And I think now what needs to be done is opening up of the schools, which is quite difficult because the vaccine is not being given to children. And I only think it's because it hasn't been tested out on children. So that might be the country's next big step and big move. And then
It sounds like the steps that they've taken are pretty proportionate when we're looking at, whether or not what rules they've introduced, the impact on civil liberties. So I think it's interesting to see it from a different perspective where, again, similar to Rafid, but in a different way, where you have a balancing exercise. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Anjalik.
Thank you.
I will now move on to Gobin. Gobin was called to the bar in November 2019 with Lincoln's. He is an accredited mediator and is currently a paralegal at Bachman & Carter, a boutique law firm in Malaysia. So Gobin, over to you.
Hi, yes, so I am from Malaysia, that one country in between Thailand and Singapore that everyone forgets about. I will be talking about how we responded to the restrictions, and then also the government support for the civilians as well as companies, and then moving on to dealing with the political instability amidst the crisis, and also then the vaccine rollout and the efficacy of it. So we had our first case in Malaysia in early January, I think January 24th, coming in from Singapore. And we sustained very low number of cases for a very long time until about March 16, which is when we saw a spike of cases. And then the whole country went into lockdown, and we had, luckily, we already had an act in place, which was our Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases Act from 1988. The way we drafted it was broad enough that it could be applied to the current pandemic, so that there wasn't really a need, luckily enough for us, considering that our parliament was suspended. So if we had required any new acts to be passed, we would have been in a very tough position. But luckily, our acts were broad enough, and we were to immediately shut down, go into lockdown. The military was deployed, and you were not allowed to leave your house for any reasons, including exercise, unless it was to get groceries or only essential services. And even then, most often than not, you would be stopped because there were patrols everywhere, and that lasted until about May, which is when we saw a reduction in cases, and the government was comfortable enough to get people to stop working from home and return to their offices. And ever since that was the first spike we had, but since then we've had 3 spikes. One relating to a religious gathering that was not properly contained, and the Malaysian reaction to the virus has mostly been more reactionary as opposed to stopping it before it happens. We would have an issue and then we would deal with it. So with the outbreak at the religious festival, we then banned all social gatherings, religious or otherwise, and we also stopped allowing people to enter the country from overseas. There was a total shutdown of our borders, and now that those restrictions have eased a bit, you are allowed to come in. We still require a 10-day quarantine, but besides that, it's still very much. We are now in our second lockdown in Malaysia. So we just came out of it. We are trying to. We've tried many ways to handle this issue because.
Can I ask you, what would be the penalty if you broke the lockdown?
So we have varying penalties, mostly being if you were a civilian that was found outside. So we had curfews in place for businesses and people during the first lockdown. You had to stop at all businesses had to stop at 8 p.m. and you were allowed to restart at 6 in the morning, I think. And people were not allowed to be outside at that time also, unless of course you were allowed to leave the house in case of a medical emergency. So we had essential services that were still allowed to open, be it public or private. So you could go to public hospitals, or you can also go to our private clinics. They were still allowed to operate even past curfew. But besides that, our restrictions were very, 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 very harsh. But we didn't really complain because it was a scary time for everyone. We didn't know how bad it was going to be, and we thought we would just listen to our government and we would just do whatever they ask us to do. So
and was anyone fined, or would you be imprisoned, or did it just not happen?
It was a fine. It was a $1,000 fine for breaching the lockdown restrictions for regular people. For companies, it was way larger. It depends. Now it's up to 50,000 ringgit if a company was found to be in violation, because some companies are now allowed to open in Malaysia, and you can work from your place of business as opposed to working from home. But we do have strict standard operating procedures in place, and if one of your employees were to be found to be breaching one of those violations, because we do get random checks from the police or the Ministry of Health, your company would then be fined. Yeah. So in terms of government support, the people did get a stimulus package very early on at around June, and then a secondary one in September. And companies also they were allowed to get access to funds if funds were required. It wasn't just a blanket statement, but it was an application that was made to our small and medium enterprises, government-linked companies that provide these loans. But there was one unanswered issue, which was what happens to all the breach of contract issues that arose in the country as a result of various lockdown measures or just inability or frustrations of contract. What happens then? And for a long time, Malaysia did not have an answer until until the 23rd of October last year, which is when we passed the COVID bill, which allowed for extensions of limitation periods which would have fallen in the period that the lockdown had occurred from March until August. If any of your limitation periods were to fall in that time, then you would then get an extension until the 31st of December, where you could then have an opportunity to get your claim if your claim were barred for.
Can I ask, so I know that recently here we had a case where the court said that businesses were able to claim under their insurance because COVID was something unexpected, and insurance companies were disputing whether or not it was. The court said it was, and people are now able to claim under their insurance. Was there something similar there for small businesses?
Most of the small business support came from the government and government-linked companies, not really from insurance. And also there has been difficulties with insurance in terms of them accepting COVID as one of the diseases that they would cover under their plans. Now, recently, insurance companies in Malaysia have changed their tune and they are willing to cover these illnesses, which as they rightly should. But for a long time, they didn't. Yeah, and as opposed to in regards to the civil liberties that were impacted for Malaysia, so there was the general lockdown, you were not allowed to move, and there was also then once things eased, a wider restriction on the number of people that were allowed in your car. There was a limit onto there was limited 2 people, then 4 people, and now that limit has been removed. For a very long time, there were a lot of arbitrary rules in Malaysia.
And how did people respond to those?
With rightfully so, with a lot of confusion, because a lot of the policies in place just they were good intentioned, and they were not made with ill intent, but of course it was not practical and it could not be enforced. Like there was an issue in Malaysia of a so in Malaysia, one of the things that we're very proud about is our street food. So we also have centers where you can, where vendors can open up their tiny stall in there and you can sell your food. So this one man makes like a version of chicken rice, and it's a family-run business with his wife and daughter, and he had to travel about 40 kilometers from where he lives to where he conducts his business. And this was during the time when the restriction on the number of people in cars were in place. So he was then tasked with a very difficult question, which is, do I drive back 40 kilometers to go pick up the third person and then go back and waste more time and petrol and resources? Or do I just get all 3 people in the car and risk it? He chose the latter, and he was fined, which caused uproar, to people, but still he was fined and he was punished. And there has been the issue with Malaysia is there has been an unequal enforcement of the punishment. So
like an inconsistent kind of application of rules.
Yeah, it's more of a class struggle in a sense that some people are allowed to go through it. That some people are allowed to break the rules just because they are supposed to, as opposed to the other people that genuinely need to feed themselves and their family. If they were to break, there's no explanation given. There's no you can't mitigate.
It's interesting when you talk about the kind of street food example and having to pick people up in the car, because there was a case here recently where it was I think it was like a pancake van outside, and it made pancakes and it was really popular. I think it was somewhere near Camden, and you were allowed to get takeaway food and takeaway coffees and everything. So he was operating, but it's really popular, and Harry Styles from One Direction is known to go there, so popular with celebrities too. And there was a big queue of people, and he was fined for being in breach of regulations because they said that the amount of people in the queue weren't social distancing, they weren't following guidelines. And he was saying, well, I've done everything you've asked me to. I have sanitized, I have markings on the floor, but I can't control people out, like halfway down the street. So there's a challenge going on with that at the moment. But it's interesting, like you say, how there's just rules can affect different businesses in different ways.
Yeah, and yes, that's also something. And we also have similar issues as compared to that in Malaysia. For restaurant owners, we have had varying standard operating procedures that they have to run under, from the number of people allowed in a restaurant to, are you even allowed in the restaurant? Are you allowed to take away? Or is it just delivery only? Or are people allowed to eat? Those rules in towards the end of last year, which was when we had our second spike, they vary day to day mostly, pretty much.
Do you think there's an issue with transparency?
No, the rules, they were completely transparent. The rules were out there as soon as they made it, but it was just playing catch up to, like, you released this procedure yesterday, and we got ready for it, and now you're telling us to change, and so we don't know which is the right procedure to follow anymore. How do we then beat ourselves?
So you're continually adapting to the changes they're putting out.
Yeah, and also causing confusion because not everyone reads everything, so they will just get what they would think is the most recent one. They would not expect a continuous update. So then there was
would that be the similar thing with enforcement then? You know, the police trying to understand what they're supposed to be regulating and how they're supposed to be finding people, if they're also trying to understand what rules are in place today as opposed to last week.
Yeah, exactly. So that just caused a lot of confusion. And also, as I was saying, Malaysia is experiencing some political instability, and it has been since the beginning of the virus. So it's interesting to see how we adapt to a virus while going through such instability. So that has ended up in us calling in a state of emergency in January, which was our fourth one. The first one because of political instability. Before this, the first three were because of race riots and the war. So this is the first time that we just can't make our mind up, and as a result, we just don't have parliament now. So we are, in a way, just following our ministers, and our ministers haven't really given a lot of faith, haven't really put a lot of faith in the public, or filled the public with a lot of faith rather. So it's just a very confusing time for Malaysia, really.
So do you think that the handling of the coronavirus pandemic has been a significant factor contributing to the political instability?
Yes, no, yes and no. It has in a way dampened the extent of the political instability, because you were home. What could happen anyways if the government was dissolving? So in that sense, it hasn't really impacted businesses as much as it would on a regular year if this were to happen in the before times. So yeah, if anything, we were actually lucky to have it during this time and to be able to sort ourselves out while we also have other things to deal with.
And what do you think will be, like I said I asked Rafid and Angelique the same thing, what's the kind of attitude towards the vaccine programme? Do you think there will be any reluctance? Is there a willingness to take the vaccine, or is it a mix?
So yeah, one of the major issues for Malaysia has been misinformation and how to deal with fake news, and whether or not we don't really have a lot of anti-vaxxers. We do have a minority of them, like any country does, but they're not protesting in the streets. They're not causing harm. They're just silent about it. But in terms of the vaccine rollout, we are actually experiencing a delayed vaccine rollout because we can't source enough vaccines. So we've staggered it. We've given it to the people that need it most first. So it's the frontliners, the doctors, our ministers. They get the vaccines so they can then go out and help our country. And in the meantime, the civilians, they're not allowed to get it privately. There's no access because we just don't have the numbers for it. You only have the choice to get it publicly through our public healthcare system.
That has been so interesting. Thank you so much, Govind. It's just so, again, like I was saying to Rafid and Angelique, just so interesting and different to see how, like, such a, vastly different approach in each jurisdiction, and how people have responded as well. I think civilians taking different attitudes to things is just really interesting. So thank you so much. So we will, if there are any questions, or if anyone would like to ask any of the panelists something, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll wait a minute or two if we get any questions, and then if not, we will close up. I don't think we have any questions at the moment, so thank you very much to everyone for tuning in and listening to us, and thank you very much to all the panelists, and we will be back with another webinar soon. So thank you.